All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. It is 4 o'clock, and today is Wednesday, May 15th, 2024. We are getting ready to start our special city council meeting. It is our mid-cycle budget workshop, and so I'm going to go ahead and call that meeting to order now at 4 o'clock. And Madam Clerk, if you wouldn't mind calling the roll, please.
Councilmember Estrada is absent. Councilmember Carwin is absent. Councilmember Sobek? Here. Mayor Pro Tem Dinas?
Here.
And Mayor Zimmerman.
And I'm here. Thank you. Let's go ahead and stand for the flag salute. Ready, begin. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. All right, thank you. So we're going to get started with our mid-cycle budget workshop. I see Mr. Travis Hickey coming to the podium to introduce the item and get us started. So welcome, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, members of the council. I'm happy to be here today to present this workshop. I think, as I mentioned at our mid-year update, the process of the budget is just such a team effort. It feels a bit unfair to be the one here presenting it, but that we're in finance, that's our role. But really, this is a representation of a ton of work put in by all of the departments. And so just wanted to begin by thanking all of my fellow department heads, their staffs, particularly their analysts, for all of the work they did, for the finance staff, in particular, my deputy director, Margarita Corniejo, the principal accountant, Dominic Tartaglia, and our financial analyst, Lori Lockwood, along with all of the finance staff, and our city manager for his leadership, and as well for the city council for your leadership as well. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started. So, really overriding the overall budget process is the 5-year strategic plan that the council is well aware of. And so all of the 5 overriding strategies for the city really play into everything that is incorporated into the budget and our analysis as we go through the departmental requests. So just kind of an outline of the workshop. We're going to talk a little bit about the process of the two-year budget and the mid-cycle review that we're in now. We're going to go through the budget summary and recommended adjustments. We'll look at the revenues, the operating expenditures, a little bit on the capital improvement program adjustments. We'll also look outside of the general fund, look at the quality of life, the special revenue funds, the ARPA funds, and the recommended adjustments for those, as well as our LLMDs, community county service areas, and our CFDs as well. So, and lastly, we'll finish up with a look at the city's reserve policy and have a discussion about that. So just kind of big picture in terms of the budget, what it is, what it was used for. You know, on the left side there, we have our kind of what goes into the planning and putting a budget together. On the right side is management and use of the budget. And so, you know, not only is this a total city effort to put a budget together, it's really a living and breathing document that really gets used every day. And so, you know, in putting the budget together, we're looking at, you know, long-range financial planning, workforce, the development, use of our internal service funds, the CIP program, you know, in terms of putting the budget together. And then once we have a budget, we monitor that against our actual revenues and expenditures. We look at items that may need to be carried over from one year to the next when additional appropriations are needed. And so again, it really is a living and breathing document. So where we're at today is the update for the mid-cycle, or what we call the mid-cycle budget review. As the council knows, we are getting ready to go into year 2 of this 2-year cycle. And so a few months ago, we had the mid-year review for year 1. And so now we're at the mid-cycle review, which is going into year 2. So we already have an adopted budget for fiscal year 24-25. So the real crux of this review is to look at what adjustments need to be made as we gear up for the start of the new fiscal year. You know, some of the things that go into a 2-year budget, you know, we hope to be able to streamline the process, but, you know, it's certainly still a lot of work for departments to go through and do that. It is difficult to project out a year, you know, more than a year for your budget, and so inevitably there are adjustments necessary, but really more than streamlining, it's just trying to develop that long-term financial planning picture, you know, looking out 2 years. But we want to also, you know, assure the council and the public there is no change in the amount of interaction or transparency with the public. We still do our mid-year reviews. We're doing this mid-cycle review, and so there really is no drop-off in kind of public interface with doing a 2-year budget or a lack of transparency or anything like that. So when we talk about the budget, there's kind of 2 main sides of the budget, the operating budget and the capital or CIP budget. In the operating budget is where we're going to have the majority of our personnel, the programs and services, also our capital outlay. So these are kind of one-time significant purchases, but don't rise to the level of capital improvement projects. So on the other side is the capital improvement budget, and that is where we see our infrastructure, a variety of different categories of improvements that fit within the CIP, facility improvements, a whole host of items that fit under the CIP. Under both categories of operating and capital, the funding sources could be from any of the city sources, including the general fund, the quality of life fund, our special revenue funds, also our development impact fees, a variety of TUMP fees, grants, and so forth, all play into the funding sources. So this is, you know, kind of the 30,000-foot view of the city's overall budget. You know, the total citywide budget that we're proposing for fiscal year 24-25 with the adjustments is second column from the right there at the bottom, total citywide budget of $136 $12,088,000. And so that includes both the general fund and quality of life funds, as well as the special revenue and other funds, as well as the capital improvement project. So we'll go into kind of each of these areas in more detail as we go through. And also for the council, please interrupt me as we go along if you have any questions as we go. So as we look at the 24-25 mid-cycle review, just kind of going around the slide here, we look at kind of what's going on in the economy and the forecast as we look at the revenues. So we'll look at that in a little more detail. But bigger picture, we are seeing a slowdown in growth, not so much of a decline, but really as a plateauing or leveling off of growth. And so when we look at the operating budget adjustments that we will go into more detail, we're really focused on kind of mission critical and required things that we have to do right now. We don't really have much leeway in working these things into the budget. And again, we'll get to those in more detail, as well as the capital improvement program, looking at the additional funding for priority CIP projects. So when we look at the mid-cycle process overall that brought us here today, we did have a CIP workshop on April 17th. We had a quality of life committee meeting on May 7th. We're here today with this workshop, and then we'll be coming back to the council at the June 5th meeting to seek adoption of the adjusted budget.
Real quick, a question for you.
Yes,
At
sir.
the time we adopt the budget, will we then see the 23-24 final budget and how we did what the actual estimated actuals are for the end of the fiscal year? We're all doing this for the first time with a 2-year cycle, so I was wondering when when 23-24 comes to an end, when are we going to see how we ended, even if it's projected, so we kind of have an idea how we did?
Yeah, I mean, certainly we won't even be at the end of the year yet, and a number of, especially our revenues, take several months to true up to find those actual numbers. But in terms of projection, I would ask Margarita to comment on that.
Yeah, we can provide in this iteration for June 5th is kind of more in the carryover and expenditure side. We do have the final months after the year officially closes on June to close out and go through our audit process. So where you guys will see, here's your concrete numbers, definitively really is in that December, kind of no later than January timeframe where we're getting the final audit from our independent auditors to complete that. If the request is when we come back in June to have some element of projections of 23-24. We can give you year-to-date actuals at that point, and again, more on the carryovers and anticipated final expenditures.
Right, because you should have you should have a good idea how we're going to end the fiscal year before December.
You're
It'd be
right.
good for us to know that, to see, because now without knowing how we're going to possibly end this year, how we go forward in the next year, it'd be kind of nice to know how, if we met the target or not.
Okay, that is an element that we can build into going as feedback into June 5th as we go into that year.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and I think that it would probably be more realistic to do it a little bit earlier than like she talked about in December or January, but have some kind of projected actuals, maybe August, September timeframe. I think in June 5th is still really early. I mean, our sales tax alone is 2 months behind, and so it's our expenditures we always expect to come within budget, and so our projections would typically be what our budget is, maybe a little bit of savings, but I think to have some meaningful projections would be, as we get towards the end of summer. So we will shift to looking at the revenue adjustments for the general fund and the quality of life fund. On this slide here, you do see revenues and expenditures, but this is just to kind of show the overall balance of the revenues and expenditures. Off on the right-hand side, we show that the budget as adjusted, the proposed adjusted budget is structurally balanced. Our revenues exceeding expenditures by a bit over $360,000. But if you come back to the middle of the slide, the darker shaded area there are mid-cycle adjustments shows the adjustments in the various categories. Our total revenue adjustment is just over $465,000, and so sort of a change for the city of Menifee in terms of the growth of revenues that we haven't seen this sort of plateauing, and so that's kind of the economic conditions we're in at this point. And so our proposed adjusted total revenues just over $95.1 million, and we'll look at those in a little more detail as we go along. So these are, kind of the different factors that we keep in mind as we're analyzing the city's revenues, both, national, state, and locally. You see the first bullet point under the state there. The state is looking at a $68 billion deficit, depending on what figures you look at, but that's the most recent estimate from the Legislative Analyst's Office, $68 billion deficit for the state. I think it's important to point out that doesn't impact the city's revenues directly. There have been a number of constitutional amendments that really restrict the state's ability to direct revenues, to redirect revenues intended for local governments, but it is an indication of kind of what is going on in the economy and the challenges the state is facing overall. Although we don't see a major decline in the economy, we are seeing still persistent high inflation. Interest rates are still high. Unemployment is not exactly high, but not as low as the federal government would like it to be. And so all of these factors have been taken into account as we've looked at our revenues. Locally, we do still see strong development activity here. Our development departments are still very active with projects. We have a lot of projects, industrial projects under CEQA review, and so there is a lot of activity there, and so we expect that to really improve the city's financial condition as the general economy picks up and these projects get well underway.
Travis, can you go back, please?
Sure.
I'm just curious about, in the local box, the sales tax revenue, looking like reduced projections. And I'm just curious if we know why that is. Is there less consumer spending? It seems like we're adding new businesses, and so there should be increases year after year, but we're saying we're kind of holding the line and looking like it's flat, so maybe you can explain.
Sure. I think it's a couple of factors. We are seeing less consumer spending as inflation has increased. We have seen less consumer demand. And so that is kind of an overarching factor that we're seeing really statewide. I think more really specific to our situation here, when we projected the sales tax revenues for year 2 of the budget, it was based on assumed continuation of growth. And so this year we are looking like we will meet our budget projections, but really that's based on getting some one-time revenues from the Nova Battery project. Absent that, we would have missed our budget projections for this year. And so looking at last year's projections and then building a growth factor into that, we're just not expecting to have that growth. So this reduction is really kind of bringing us down really to be more in line with what we're expecting this year and really what it was 2 years ago. So it's not so much that our revenues really are declining, it's that we had built growth into the projections and we're dialing that back.
Okay, and then just to add to that, there's sales tax receipts out there at our retailers, but then there's also, and this has a big impact on quality of life, online purchases and things like that. I know during COVID, a lot of people shifted there, and maybe they've shifted away from that. I don't know. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
No, I think we do still see that. I mean, that trend of online ordering does continue. In fact, when we look at the quality of life revenue, just the way the sales tax works for quality of life is different from what we call the Bradley-Burns sales tax, which Bradley-Burns is driven by point of sale, whereas the quality of life is point of destination. And so for an in-city restaurant purchase, both sales taxes are going to apply. But when our residents who live in the community order goods from outside of the city, that quality of life sales tax, they are paying that, but they're not paying the Bradley Burns share of that tax. And so when we look at the ratio, our quality of life runs about 120% of our Bradley Burns sales tax. So that's that extra tax being generated from online orders being made outside the city, being delivered to within the city, as well as things like vehicle purchases. When you buy a vehicle outside of the city, if you reside or if it's registered within the city, the quality of life tax applies to that as well. And so we see that ratio about 120%. And that trend seems to be continuing. And just generally, spending in general has not so much slowed down, but really stabilized.
Thank you.
Okay, so we'll look at each of these revenues in a little more detail. These are kind of the 6 main revenues for the general fund and quality of life. The sales tax we talked about a little bit already, but we are recommending a 5.5% decrease in that, totaling about $1.88 million. Our property tax, the property tax really adjusts slower to changes in the economy. Your assessed valuation doesn't go down because the economy slows down. And so our analysis of the sales property tax indicates that we are good with our adjustment. We're not recommending an increase in that, but we feel confident about our existing budget with property tax. Vehicle in lieu, which really works like property tax, but we're recommending just a very minor increase in that, about $68,000. As I mentioned before, our development departments are still staying very busy with projects going on in the city, so we're recommending a $768,000 increase to all of the building planning and engineering development fees generated from their departments. Our franchise fees also remain strong as the city adds new housing units and we bring in new residents. As our population grows, that increases our franchise fees, particularly our waste hauler fees. That is somewhat offset by, we're seeing a continuing trend in a decline in our cable franchise fees as more and more homes go to streaming services. Less and less people are paying for cable, and so that is somewhat mitigating the increases we're seeing in gas, electric, and especially trash franchise fees. The most positive note on our revenue is our investment income. Kind of the flip side of high interest rates on the positive for the city is that we are generating more investment income on our investments held in our reserve accounts. And so we're recommending about $1 million increase in that revenue. So this is a table showing all of the proposed revenues. You can see under the proposed column there and that percentage change. The sales tax for the general fund, about a 6.5% reduction. Quality of life sales tax down 4.66. And so that's kind of the major reductions there, offset by the other categories I mentioned. The major change in the other there that went up just over $1 million, majority of that is an additional investment income of $1 million that we're projecting. So shifting now to the expenditure side of the budget, this is a look at the various departments separated on the top in blue with the general fund, on the bottom, the quality of life. And so we'll kind of dissect this a little bit, but this is just the kind of big picture overview. At the bottom there, the second column from the right, proposed adjusted budget, $96.6 million. Is our overall recommended adjusted expenditure budget for both general fund and quality of life. We'll get into some of these details. This is just a look at it graphically. Like most municipalities, public safety is our lion's share of the expenses for general fund, and quality of life, being an unrestricted revenue, is effectively part of the general fund. And so those together versus public safety, we're at just under 55% of the budget towards public safety. And then you can see the other departments or functions in their relative share of the pie. So as I mentioned before, in terms of looking at the operating budget, we, further kind of breaking that down on the operating side, we have the personnel costs, operating and maintenance expenses, and then capital outlays. We are seeing increases in both personnel costs and the operating and maintenance costs, and seeing a reduction in our capital outlay costs by recommending a shift of some previously adopted expenditures to other more restricted revenue sources like the DIF accounts and our ARPA funding. So we'll look at these in a little bit more detail. Shifting to our personnel requests, in the top left corner there, you see our total FTEs. We're actually proposing to eliminate one vacant position, which is in the fire marshal's office. That is going to now be picked up under our contract with Riverside County. So our full-time FTEs as proposed and adjusted is 333.5. The savings from the elimination of that position are being recommended to be used for the position reclassifications you see there. These are all reclassification type adjustments. We're not recommending to add any new full-time positions. So we have an upgrade of a management analyst, an upgrade of a management aide, public works inspector, and a police sergeant to police lieutenant. So there's a little bit of net savings once you factor in those reclassifications relative to the savings from the one position there.
Real quick on the update, the reclassifications. I didn't see any in the material for any discussion or justification why they were being reclassified. Or is it just a reorganization, or why are we doing? I'm just curious.
Yeah, so all of the reclassifications, the management analyst, the public works inspector, and the management aide were recommendations that came out of the class and compensation study. And so as part of our process of working with the departments and going through this review, each of the reclassification requests, the departments needed to provide their justification for it. These documents went through the Human Resources Office, who gave their kind of view or input on the proposed reclassification, and then ultimately what you see here is what was.
Okay, so it was a direct result of the class and comp then.
It was.
For most part, anyways.
I don't believe that the lieutenant to the sergeant reclassification was specifically identified in the class and compensation study, but was more requested due to operational needs of the department, because you have so many lieutenants that have so many functions that should be done by a lieutenant, and they were short one of those functions. And so the upgrade of the sergeant to a lieutenant was not specifically identified, but was more for operational needs of the police department.
All right, thank you.
Okay, so this is a look at the other items, non-personnel related. On the left is the capital outlays. We have some one-time costs that we need to spend about $50,000 in an upgrade in our technology infrastructure to match an upgrade that was done by a City of Murrieta, who we contract with for dispatch services. We also have savings of about $664,000 in moving the cost of police vehicle replacements out of the general fund and funding those through development impact fees, as well as shifting some ARPA funding to cover a portion of those as well. So no change in the overall number of vehicles or cost of the vehicles, but shifting that cost from the general fund to the ARPA and DIF funds for public safety. On the right-hand side, and on the operating and maintenance categories, at the top, we have an increase of about $341,000 in our insurance and claims costs, which we'll talk about that one in a little more detail. Then we have a category of what we call previously approved items. So this was the aquatics program, the council stipends, and other personnel adjustments that were done as part of the mid-year cycle. So all of those together added to about $289,000 increase. On the dispatch side, the 50,000 I mentioned before was kind of the one-time technology cost to accommodate the new system, but there's an increase of about 150,000 for personnel costs related to their MOU negotiations, which is on the operating side. We also saw just over $100,000 increase in our share of the animal control services. And then we mentioned the fire contract here, although we're not asking for a increase in the budget there. We're actually projecting to have a savings due to some one-time items that will be realized through our contract with the county, but we are recommending to use those savings to set aside for fire equipment replacements that will be needed down the road. And then we are also recommending a use of $34,000 from our technology surcharge fund to pay for the integration of Acela and Bluebeam software to streamline our development review process. Okay, so I mentioned we would talk some more about the insurance premium. So one thing we're proposing with our insurance risk management pool is to increase our self-insured retention for both our workers' compensation and our general liability claims. And so currently our workers' compensation has a $50,000 retention and our general liability has $150,000, which means the city is on the hook for every claim up to that amount. Once we reach that retention amount, then everything above that is picked up through our risk pool. And so by increasing our retention, this works the same as like a deductible on your car insurance. So by increasing our deductible or self-insurance retention, we can significantly reduce our insurance premiums. Now the trade-off is we are on the hook for more of those costs to the extent we have claims above that level. But our risk management folks have met with our risk pool managers and analyzed our claims activity. And based on our level of claims and the very few number of claims that we've had in excess of both our current levels and the proposed levels, we believe that we can realize savings ongoing of about $500,000 a year. And you can see from this chart here what our premiums would be if we kept our same self-insurance retention levels. So we would be saving about $744,000. So to be clear, that savings is not from our adopted budget because we had not built into our adopted budget the current premiums there. And so we do still have a net increase that we're asking for our insurance costs, as I mentioned before, about $340,000. But if we don't increase our self-insured retentions, it would be even more that we would need to pay for our premium costs.
Can I ask you a question about that?
Yes, sir.
So are the general liability and workers' comp bundled, or are they separate policies?
They're separate. They're not really even policies. They're programs that we participate within our risk management pool.
So the reason I'm asking that is because with regard to general liability, you're looking to increase the SIR by $150,000, but the premium only goes down $200,000. So, I mean, isn't that kind of that's not really a huge difference for the risk of having to pay an extra $150,000 out of pocket?
Well, I mean, I think that we've
because that's per claim, right? The SIR.
Correct, per claim.
So if we get two claims that go up to $300,000, that would be more than the savings by a considerable amount.
It would be, but in looking at it, we've only had one claim that was over $300,000 in the last 3 years, and so we think that based on our claims history and based on proactive prevention measures that we can minimize our claims. Certainly a city is always exposed to risks, both general liability and workers' comp, but our risk management pool gave us a list of various retention levels and what that would do to the premium, and this one just made the most sense from staff standpoint that we're recommending. So it is a savings of only $200,000, but if we keep on pace with only one claim every 3 years, that's $600,000 versus that one claim that might be $300,000. So.
All right, thank you.
But that was part of our discussion because it, you know, at the next level, at 300,000 going to a $500,000 retention level, it was like even less savings. And so that, we felt like that was kind of the sweet spot to achieve the most savings without taking on too much more risk, so. Okay. Sorry. And we'll talk about it a little bit more at the end also, but part of our strategy with this is to recommend setting aside a self-insurance reserve as part of our general fund balance policy. And we'd recommend like 500,000, which would cover, you know, one claim each for both workers' comp and general liability in the event that we had, you know, we still budget for those claims annually, but in the event that we had more than one large claim hit the city, we would have money set aside for that. So, and we'll talk about that at the end of the presentation. On the previous slide, I didn't really mention it, but there is a portion of the expenditures we're proposing to use out of fund balance, a total of 1.7 million. The majority of that is 1.375 million that we're projecting to have available out of our quality of life fund to pay for the Cherry Hills Facility Phase 1 project, which is the police substation. And I'll talk about it in a second. This is slightly different from what we saw April 17th. April 17th, we proposed the 1.375 being split between the general fund and quality of life. But as I mentioned, with some of the one-time revenues received from the Nova battery project, we expect to have balance available in quality of life to fully fund that 1.375. So we're recommending to use that entire balance out of the quality of life fund for the Cherry Hills facility project. Aside from that, out of the general fund, there's about just shy of 335,000 being proposed to use a fund balance from the general fund. The top line there, that $100,000 is to fund a safety master plan, which was part of the strategic plan items. That's a one-time cost that we feel comfortable recommending to use the general fund balance to pay for that. The 50,000 I had mentioned earlier regarding our dispatch services technology upgrade, using fund balance to pay for that 50,000. The other two items come out of really restricted fund balance accounts within the general fund. The first one being our AMR fees that we have accumulated in there. We're recommending to use just under 151,000 to purchase 25 AED machines and 21 thermal imaging units for the fire suppression personnel out of that fund. And then again, the 34,000 for the Acela and Bluebeam software integration and update for a total of 334,792 use of general fund balance. Okay, that kind of covers the general fund revenues, expenditures, shifting now to look at the CIP program. This, as I mentioned, it is identical to what was presented at the April 17th workshop, with the exception that we are recommending to use the full 1.375 million out of the quality of life fund instead of splitting that between quality of life and the general fund. So you can see in the bottom right there's the 1.375 out of our special revenue funds is an additional 1.8 million. So it's an additional 3.225 million total that we're recommending to supplement our CIP projects. You can see on the two charts there going from 21 projects to 27 for a total cost of 15,577,212. And we'll run through that list of projects here. So this is slide one of those projects. You see the original adopted funding level for the project, and then the far right column is the proposed funding level for the project. And again, this is consistent, identical to what we presented April 17th. So I'll go quickly unless you want to pause or talk about any of the projects. This is the second slide. You can see, again, the adjusted recommended funding level on the right-hand side totaling the $15.577 million. I think it was also mentioned at April 17th, but that one in red there, second from the bottom, is the elimination of one project. So that was originally included, but has been canceled. Okay. Okay, I'm going to turn it over to Margarita to talk about the Measure DD and quality of life and our special revenue fund budgets.
Hello, good afternoon. I'll be brief and just provide a general summary on quality of life, which we've touched on a little bit, the special revenue funds that also contribute to the operating and capital improvement program budget, and then ARPA, as we start winding out that funding that has provided the city funding for a number of projects, where we are, where we've been, and kind of what the remainder of that funding looks like. So quality of life was enacted, as everyone knows, in 2017. In the first full year of collections of that revenue source, the city collected just under 10 million. I think it was 9.98. And less than 10 years into it, we're just over the $20 million mark. So that funding source in itself has really provided the city the ability to move forward with some vital capital projects, but also some important local priorities, like setting up our own police department in itself. As has been discussed this afternoon, for 24-25 in the upcoming year, the revenues for quality of life and sales tax are being revised down to recalibrate with the trends that have been showing for the last year in itself. From the revised projections we have received from HDL, the trajectory of quality of life for the next 5 years does show an overall continued growth. So we anticipate continuing to rely and use this funding to fund our public safety and infrastructure areas in particular. When the budget was adopted in 24-25, it was just over $21.5 million with no recommended use of fund balance at that point in time. The funding was distributed to fund code enforcement, that's 3 officers, the fire contract that's in place, not all of it, but a big component of it, as well as a component of the dispatch agreement with Marietta and the personnel of Menifee PD. To date, historically, the funding provides 35% of all personnel associated with the police department, that's sworn and non-sworn. And the other 65% is paid by general fund, with the exception of 1 police officer that's paid by CSA 86. There was CIP program recommendations of just under $400,000, and based on the analysis that was done for mid-year, there is a recommendation of increasing the appropriations in the upcoming year for the $1.375 million, and that's again for the Cherry Hills project that is using fund balance based on the fund balance that's in place and projected for the end of 23-24. And then there is a reduction on the fire side on the operating costs to accommodate the reduction in the upcoming costs. So it is not a reduction in fire contract cost as a whole of what's being budgeted, but instead being shifted to the general fund. So the revised budget for 24-25 with respect to quality of life recommends an adjusted budget of $22.2 million. There is some slight adjustment in the interest side as well. And the recommendation that is presented to council today for input was also presented to the Quality of Life Oversight Committee on May 7th, and they provided a recommendation for council's consideration to move forward with this. Here is on the CIP side, the breakdown of the 396. In the original budget adoption of June of last year, it was 1 project that was recommended to be funded. It was the Garbani Road drainage improvements, and with the addition of the Cherry Hills facility phase 1, that's where you result in the $1.7 million. Moving on to our other funds that contribute to the overall budget, the internal service funds, gas tax, and special revenues. This is in summary what was adopted on the revenue side as well as the expenditure side. So it was just over $37 million when the budget was adopted in June of last year. The adopted expenditures were slightly less than the projected revenues. With the proposed adjustments that are being recommended today, there is the use of fund balance, and a lot of that is directed on the CIP side. $1 million of that alone is the Road RBBD, moving towards a CIP project. But other adjustments that are presented for consideration today on the revenue side, across the board, there is just a recommendation to bring interest earnings in adjustment to what is projected for next year based on historicals of this year and in a continued healthy interest kind of earnings environment. Revenue that is being recommended for ARPA projects is also being recognized in the part of recommendations to be recognized in 24-25. The special district area with the lighting and landscaping maintenance districts, the CSAs and CFDs where applicable are also subject to annual adjustments like CPI. So these revenue recommendations reflect that as well. And there is anticipation by when we come on June 5th, those revenues might be slightly higher because there are some permit activity that is reviewed during this May period. So when we give you the final totals for June 5th, you might see the CFD side on the maintenance side slightly increased. On the expenditure adjustments of what's being increased, there's a $1.8 million of additional funding that was discussed by Travis earlier. That's the larger modification. On the grant fund, DIF fund, it is the reprogramming or redirecting of the patrol cars that were originally approved to be funded out of the general fund, and instead using ARPA funding for that, as well as the law enforcement DIF towards that. On the CFD funds, two of the positions that are recommended are partially funded by special districts, so this would absorb some of the costs, not all of them. On AQMD funding, there is the recommendation of a purchase of a Ford Maverick fleet vehicle. It's an eligible vehicle to be used for that, and it is restricted to be used really for only particular purposes, so this meets the funding requirements. On the PEG side, there are various AV hardware equipment, including an encoder that facilitates the streaming of meetings. That is being recommended for $42,000. And on the IT side, there are various larger projects, including a CS recreation software system update, a phone system replacement, a computer and equipment replacement that are pulling from the IT fund balance to move those forward in 24-25. And last but not least, on the lighting and landscaping special district side, there's an opportunity to introduce a kind of dedicated property tax finder portal for the public to be able to more readily access and find more detailed, customized information available to properties throughout the city. It is absorbed by the special districts themselves, and it is an opportunity, again, to increase that visibility and information available to the public. That is a cost of $24,000. So on the special districts, it just summarizes, in particular, the LLMDs, the CFDs, and the CSAs. The LLMDs and the CSAs were districts that the city absorbed when we incorporated and used to maintain a variety of services throughout the city, everything ranging from right-of-way maintenance to traffic signals to law enforcement in our CSA 86 and road maintenance. The CFDs are ones that the city has formed since we starting with our AMR CFD and just continuing to add those. Those are the areas where we most are adding funds on it, but it also provides the city a mechanism to continue to provide guaranteed maintenance at the standards that the city has established as new development comes in. So this summarizes them in itself. Of note, of 24-25, the adopted budget did include at least 2 of our older special districts that have some general fund contribution, and that's in LLMD 89-1, Zone 3, that is the largest zone the city has, and then CSA 145. It is not an additional appropriation that's being requested in this, but it was already included in 24-25, but just identifying it here. Moving on to American Rescue. So in total, the city received just over $13.2 million in response to the COVID pandemic. And at the time when that was put out, there was some general guidelines, but also flexibility for agencies to kind of use that money, as it is one-time money, in ways that would support the impacts ranging all the way from the immediate public health impacts to economic impacts of the pandemic on an agency. But there was always a horizon that was set from the very beginning that this money would be one-time and that it would also conclude and needed to be spent by a certain time. The city's kind of deadline and all agencies' deadline is to have all ARPA funds encumbered, or at least an encumbrance form no later than December 31st, 2024, and that it be fully spent by December 31st, 2026. as this is one-time money with specific kind of parameters on how it can be used by best practice and just financial management. It has been the city's practice to direct this money into one-time uses, capital projects wherever possible, as you know, once it's gone, while the $13 million is a substantial amount of money, it won't be replaced. So here is a summary of, to date, all the funding that has been assigned from inception of the city receiving this money. In the gray shaded areas are projects that have outstanding balances, are completed, and or are being recommended for reprogramming. The recommendation to reprogram this money is, one, the projects that are completed, there's no additional expenses that are needed at this time, so it's closing it out and redirecting that funding. And then the one specific, the menu grant under economic development, that recommendation of that $470,000 is just to move that forward because there is a timeliness on moving this ARPA money, or at least putting it in an encumbrance form. We have, I think, the most recent activity that, other than that was added, was the jobs program with the chamber in the winter of 2023. That already has an MOU and agreement in place, so there would be an encumbrance in place. So what's being recommended at this stage is that there's about $595,000 that are being recommended to be directed into capital projects or the purchase of those vehicles. The specific capital projects that were identified on April 17th to fund with ARPA are the K. Ceniceros display sign, as well as Sun City Boulevard Street Medians project for a total of $150,000. And then the balance of $445,000 is recommended to move forward with the purchase of the patrol vehicles. That concludes the presentation on that component of it, and I will turn it back to Travis on the reserve fund policy review.
Okay, home stretch here. So this final topic here is to revisit the city's existing fund balance policy. This was adopted by the council in 2021. I think at that time, and just generally best practices, we should look at this every 3 years. So here we are. On the right side, we look at the existing policy. We have a minimum of 35%, which is broken down into those 3 categories there: an operating stabilization reserve at 12.5%, economic uncertainty reserve at 12.5%, and then an unassigned fund balance reserve at 10%. So also under the policy, we have, even though it's set at 35%, we don't consider it excess fund balance until it's over 40%. So there's kind of this 5% that is in limbo or not considered surplus until it's over that 40% total level. So those balances of the reserve that you see there, the $11.8 million for both operating stabilization and economic uncertainty, as well as the $9.458 million for the unassigned, are based on our 24-25 projected adjusted expenditures of $94.580 million. So looking at some potential considerations for the council, one thought might be to just make the reserve 40%, maybe kick up both the operating and economic uncertainty reserves to 15% each, and keep the unassigned reserve at 10%, and just call it a 40% reserve. Really, when we think about reserves, there's kind of different categories, and so we think of those categories of reserves as like our reserves for insurance. This is setting money aside for a rainy day, whether it's a catastrophic event or economic downturn, those kinds of things. And so we would call these kind of reserves for insurance. So we don't really have any established reserves outside of these. And so some things that we would throw out for the council's consideration, and we'd call these kind of reserve for savings. These are to hopefully kind of smooth out budgetary impacts as we go forward in the future, and kind of 4 categories that we've identified that the council may want to consider would be a self-insured retention, assigned fund balance, as I mentioned in our discussion about the insurance, is potentially setting aside $500,000 in an assigned fund balance account to fund a major claim that might come along that we don't have a capacity in any given year's budget to deal with. We have also talked in the past, but haven't moved forward with a fleet replacement assigned fund balance, and so we would recommend setting up a balance there, maybe as high as $1 million to start that fund. We have built quite a fleet and are going to start to see years where we have a number of replacements needed, and it may be difficult to fit all of those into a single year's budget cycle. And so setting aside some of that fund balance to help smooth that replacement over time, I think makes sense. Also, the council has in the past paid off our unfunded liability related to the pension funds. And so this is a great goal to have, but will become increasingly very difficult as the city's employee population goes on. Even if we don't grow our number of employees over time, we're going to have more employees retire. There's going to, as the pension fund grows, if there's a 5% loss in the pension fund right now, might be something we could pay off in 1 year, but 5 years from now, maybe not. And so our recommendation with that kind of a reserve would be to continue to budget at the level we've been budgeting to pay towards the unfunded liability, and in years where our actual payment is less than that, that difference would be shifted into this reserve fund to build up over time. So when we have a year where it's more substantial, we can hopefully pay it off, continue to pay it off every year. And then last, but certainly not least, would be being more deliberate about our city facilities fund balance. We have already 4.7 million set aside for the City Hall facility. There was 1 million set aside for a community center, which has been programmed for design already. But we, in looking at the costs to construct these facilities, what the financing costs for those might potentially be, the more that we can set aside as our kind of quote down payment, the better positioned the city would be. And so we would recommend really, if the council's on board with these concepts, would recommend kind of funding those first 3 levels and then really sweeping the balance into this city facilities reserve to set aside some meaningful dollars for those. And so, you know, kind of coming back to the 40% or 35% reserve we currently have, that 10% component is our unassigned reserve. And so I think that still leaves the city in a position to have some working capital to deal with kind of emergencies that might pop up, or, you know, there's still a sort of level of fund balance that is accessible, even if we set aside money as we described here. So those are our thoughts. I think, so in terms of, to wrap this up, our recommended action is to review the presentation, which everybody has done patiently, and provide input on the mid-cycle budget and the CIP budget. And so I know there were a lot of questions along the way, but certainly welcome any input or additional questions the council has.
Can you go back 2 slides, please? This one. All right, just so I understand, or we can all understand, on the left side, down at the bottom, we're talking about reserves as savings, and I agree with all of these. I'm going to call them accounts, but I'm just curious where, did you just say, and maybe you said it, these would fall under, if we look on the right side, the unassigned fund balance reserve. It's these on the left are within that, or is
No,
this separate from these?
It's separate, and it would be in addition to those. So we really look at that 35 or 40% reserve as kind of, you don't want to touch that unless you really have to. But these other balances, you put them aside intentionally to have them in years where you expect things not to be favorable and you're ready to deal with it. Whether we have a big claim that we have to deal with, or we have a year where we've got to replace 15 vehicles and we're trying to do 6 a year, but this year we've got to do a bunch. So you have a savings account you can draw on. you know, when our pension fund's going to continue to go up and down. And so to set that money aside to be there when we need it. So it's in addition to the 35 or 40%.
All right, that's helpful because I wasn't sure if it falls within, and I understand what you're saying. I think of these fund balance policies as rainy day funds for when we need it. These other things, reserves as savings, however, it's all semantics now. But it sounds to me like this is just separate accounts where we're earmarking money for a purpose and building that up. I love the idea of having that pension liability account because our goal has been to always pay down our liabilities for pensions. And there's going to be a day, like you said, where we're going to struggle with that if PERS is not making very good interest and all those things, and suddenly they start sending us the bill to make up for that. We're gonna be faced with some tough expenditures down the road. So.
And just for context, I think in the 24-25 adopted budget, we have 1.1 million programmed for an unfunded liability payment. We've been in contact with our actuary. The report doesn't come out until September or October, but he has a good sense that it's going to be in the range of, say, 750,000. So we would want to take the difference between those and set that money aside and hopefully accumulate that year after year to have a sizable balance, you know, when the amount is more than we budgeted.
Got it. All right, thank you. There was someone in the queue. I don't see a name,
Yeah.
so.
I was in the queue, thank you, Mayor. Go ahead. So this was brought up to the Finance Committee last week, and we felt that we should move forward with those 4 subgroups. The one thing I just want to clarify that I don't think was mentioned is that if there was some uncertainty or something that we could, that money's sitting there and we could use it if we needed to for something else. Was that what was discussed during the finance meeting?
Do you mean as part of the core reserve, the economic uncertainty, or the operating stabilization?
The 4 that you're projecting, was that discussed, or am I, or?
I think that the 4 that we're talking about here that would be new, I would envision those being more planned out and not being caught off guard by that as we go into a budget cycle and we talk with fleet about what their needs are for the fleet and we look at how much we can budget, we would be talking about, should we try to use some of that money to help bridge the gap, or do we have enough room to add to that fund? And so I wouldn't expect to need to tap into those because there was a drop in the economy, say, and immediately access
I
those.
believe, I thought if there was a great emergency, that it was still there. Is that, I thought that's what was discussed during the finance meeting.
And that's true. I mean, these are still fund balance
Right.
reserves, and as the council provides direction to set them aside for these purposes, in the event that something happens, the council can redirect those funds.
Right, but it's not something we would plan on doing, but it would be there.
And I
be
think you're right. We
available.
did talk about that, I think specifically in terms of the city facilities fund,
Yes.
that would be an assigned fund balance, and that would be the intention to dedicate those monies for that purpose. But in the event of an emergency, they're
Right.
not legally restricted. The council could direct those monies to be applied to a different appropriation.
Great. So I do appreciate that clarification. Thank you.
I wonder, Travis, and can you go back to that slide again? I'm a semantics guy, and it's all about trying to put labels that limit confusion or reduce confusion. So the ones on the right, we've been calling reserves, using the word reserves. And I just wonder if maybe some of these, we're calling it reserve as savings, but I wonder if we can just call it a restricted account or something that just a different word other than reserves, even though it might be that, but just to help, because I can see future council members coming in that are going to be as confused as maybe we are. So I'm just trying to think of ways to label it so that people understand, okay, these are our reserves. These are special accounts to be used for specific purposes. So.
Sure. Yeah, and we can work with the wording. I think what we're sort of have to stay within the guardrails of, within the accounting literature, they have very specific definitions of especially general fund balance, and it's got to fall into one of their defined buckets. And those buckets are like non-spendable, so that, we can't even touch that. But then you have committed, and you have restricted, and you have assigned. And each of those communicate kind of a different level of restriction on them. Restricted is restricted by law or outside party. The council, nobody has any power to redirect that money. Committed means the council has taken action to formally commit those monies. And assigned is kind of the most flexible category. So I think, as we look to June 5th to bring this back, we can kind of craft it within those parameters.
Yeah, that'd be helpful. Thank you. I think that's you,
Yes,
Lisa.
when he was speaking, I just thought of committed reserves, if that was a word, so, I don't know, that might make it a little bit clearer.
Thank you. Any other discussion, council members? Questions, comments?
Yeah, my request to speak disappeared from the queue, so. The recommendation, the update option of increasing the reserve from 35 to 40%, are these two sets of suggestions increasing the reserves to 40% and in additionally setting up these accounts, or is it a different use of that additional 5%?
It would be increasing it from 35 to 40% and additionally setting up these other 4 accounts.
So across the state, what amount of reserves do cities generally have? I was doing a quick scan, and some of the larger cities, like San Diego, is like 10%.
Yeah, it's...
and I know that's pretty scary.
It is, and it's not unusual. And I think even looking at our neighbors, I think it ranged from like 10% to 35% is...
But how many have 40 is my question. Like, why are we looking to go all the way up as high as 40? That seems like a really excessive amount to just hold.
Well, I guess as an accountant, I'm pretty conservative by nature, and to me, it seems like you could burn through that pretty quickly. I imagine, if there was something like COVID kind of hit hard, but it went away fast in the grand scheme of things. But if there was something, another health emergency, some kind of natural disaster, any number of events, and you look at that money we have set aside, even the full 11 and 9 is, say 30 million. Our budget is close to 100 million. I mean, it just gives us more opportunity to react to an emergency in a deliberate manner and not have to take drastic actions to respond to emergencies as they come up. So,
and is there a projection, and I know nobody's got a crystal ball, but projecting over the next 10 years as far as incomes go, it seems like we're in a plateau right now, but I don't see us failing. I consider maybe plateau, maybe a 1% drop, and generally increasing over the next 10 years. Am I reading that right?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, and we do have a 10-year projection that we have updated, and we generally expect growth to, happen over the 10 years. And but we also expect our expenditures to grow as well,
right.
And so, but that really kind of looks at just our revenues versus expenditures on a year after year basis. And so if we have a balanced budget every year, we don't necessarily really budget to add to our reserves. And so I think that we're talking about some relatively modest amounts for these kind of set-asides that hopefully we can add to over time. But again, it just, I think, gives us more ability to react to whether it's an emergency that gets thrust upon us or just dealing with insurance claims or differences in our fleet cycle between the number of that we need to replace every year, differences in our pension funds. And so so certainly you could, reasonable minds could disagree that 40% or 35% is too high or not too high. I think when you look at GFOA, the Government Finance Officers Association, they have best practices paper on fund balance policies and give you a number of criteria to look at. And the bottom line is there is no right number for any one particular agency. You need to look at kind of the particulars of your agency and the kind of more dependent you're on revenues that can fluctuate significantly, the higher reserves you can have, because if there's a downturn in the economy, it can react very quickly. And so for us, we are somewhat balanced between sales tax and property tax, but just in general, sales tax is a very volatile revenue source. You can see it drop very dramatically, very quickly, whereas property tax takes a period of time to decline normally. And so, but to the extent we're more dependent on sales tax, the more we should have in reserves. And just in terms of talking like GFOA's recommendation, but, and it's, you know, kind of like that with your own personal budget. The more you're on salary and you can rely on your paycheck every week, maybe the less you should have put aside. But if you're working on commission and you don't know where your next paycheck is coming from, the more it would benefit you to have more set aside. So to the more extent that your revenues are volatile, the more you would tend to want to have set aside. In addition, the city is still growing very rapidly, and so to have more reserves to tap into to deal with things that come up as the city grows and builds out, I think it makes sense to me. Again, I'm conservative, so
Sure.
you know, there's
And we appreciate that, and that's one of the reasons you're in that position. You know, first switching from a question to a comment standpoint, just to follow, I wanted that information.
I just was going to add, I believe in our finance committee meeting, it was suggested one reason is because we do have our own police department.
Sure.
that
Well,
was
what
a
I was going to
discussion.
say was, I mean, I like the idea of saving for these items. I'm not sure I'm on board with the idea of increasing the general fund reserve to 40% and then in additionally saving for these things in the current economy. I do like the idea of setting aside money for these very specific issues right here, but doing both to me seems right now might not be the timing to do it. And I defer to anybody who knows finances better than me. But I haven't seen another city that's got 40% in reserve, in general fund reserve, plus other stuff. It just seems like a lot of money to lock up in light of the projections that we have. And we could revisit it in the future if revenues start to pick up and we want to put more away. But I do like the idea, especially of the, we've been so proud of our zero unfunded pension liability, and ensuring that, to me, seems more important than a general fund increase. That's just my thought on it.
And I think just to make sure we're clear and on the same page, we're not suggesting to carve out ongoing revenues to add to these balances. So these balances would come from what's already in our general fund balance. It's more just carving them out and putting them in designated accounts for designated purpose. And so if we did this, it doesn't do anything except make the fund balance more categorized by the purpose of the fund balance, but it doesn't direct, say, revenues away from a program to add to any one of these categories, if that makes sense.
Mr. Villa wanted to chime in, and I'm not sure if
I'm
Councilmember
gonna
Sobek
try-
has more.
Actually, Travis, the last 2 minutes of explanation was covering what I wanted to explain. It's really difficult to pair two cities and say 40%, 40%, because a lot of cities are going through different situations. A lot of cities have more stable tax revenue structures, right? I could name a couple of cities to the south. One of the things that we worry about in Menifee is the vulnerability of some of our revenue sources, right? We depend largely on development fees. What is it, roughly about $20 million, $22 million in revenue fees, which fuels our revenue sources. So our situation is a little bit different than the cities to the south, to the north, because we have that vulnerability. It's a strength right now because development is strong, but there'll be a time when development will slow down, and we won't have $20 million of revenue, which sets us apart and maybe a little bit unique, that we should have a larger reserve because of that factor. But if you were to compare apples to apples, every city is different, and every city puts that amount away based on their situation, like Travis explained. No two cities are the same, and there are cities that have a lot of commercial and a lot of shopping centers and a lot of tax base that is vulnerable, but not as vulnerable as the one revenue source that we have, which is $20 million from development fees. which is important for us to say, we got to think and develop a way to curb that in the event something goes down in the economy and we have no development. Even 50% of our development, that's $10 million. So, you know, I think it's a good idea for us to plan and maybe increase our revenue from 35 to 40, just on that aspect alone.
I think also part of it was that our current policy, even though it's 35%, we don't consider it excess fund balance until it's over 40%. So in my mind, it's kind of just formalizing it's 40%, because effectively it's 40% now because we don't consider it excess until you reach over that extra 5%. So that was part of the thinking as well.
I'll just throw a little comment in there. I think it's a good thing. We can count our blessings that we've had some very solid years in the last 10 years. But at the beginning of our city, there was times when we were tapping into reserves to be able to have a balanced budget, and those days will come again. So having this reserve fund policy, it's something to be proud of. It's something to be able to do while you can, because there will be days when we're going to struggle. So, but yes, 40, I mean, that's something that to tout. If we're able to do that, just like we share with people when they say, you know, you're not very fiscally conservative or whatever, and we can say, hey, we're like one of the only agencies that has zero unfunded liabilities. And we have the highest reserve fund policy. I mean, it's really something that's good. So anyway, Councilman Dynas is in the queue.
Thanks. A few things. You know, when it came to the Finance Committee, we did discuss it in, you know, it was recommended that we forward with a 40% instead of 35% for a few reasons. One, and I think Armando spoke well of it, that all cities are different. I look at, like, when I worked, I didn't know if I could have the same income all the time, so you had to put money away. And now, then retirement, a little more stable, I don't have to worry about it as much. So I think that's kind of like, we're still in the working part of our city's life here, so I think that's important for that. But there are a few other things. It's because, and it's not going to be, you know, if a downturn in the economy comes, it'll be when. You know, I think that's about the only thing I remember from my business school, is that the business cycle goes up and down like that. And it's unique right now, but I've lived through enough having to do government budgets that when it goes down, it can go down hard. And the problem with government is that when the economy starts turning around, the government lags so much that it takes a long time for the government to see that the improvement happening. So most governments agencies struggle for a while because of different reasons. So I think having that there is important to do that for this city right now. I think if we're mature and had stable revenues, that'd be fine. Second of all, you know, we do live in California, which has a lot of natural disasters, you know, earthquakes and other good stuff, you know, and so we need to be prepared for that. And also, we'll come to a point in time where we're going to have to finance a building. You know, we're not going to be able to pay cash for a $60 million or whatever the dollar amount is, City Hall or something. We'll have to do some kind of financing. The better position we are in our budget, the better rates we'll get. So it's more longer term, but something we have to take into account. And finally, I know when we set as a council the fund balance policy a few years back, and to look at it every 3 years, I believe the intent was to take it up to 40% all along. So I think we're just now getting to the point where what we set as policy to actually happen. And so that's why I support the 40% right now for that. So it's important to do that and set us, you know, then the reserves for savings, you know, it's kind of like, I think it's a great idea. You know, it's not just savings, it's to kind of smooth out costs from year to year. I think that's the important part. Instead of having to dig deep in our pocket one year, we can kind of level that out and give some stability to our budgeting. So and that's why in the Finance Committee, I support it, and I support it now. Thanks.
Travis, you mentioned earlier that going to a 40% would be something that is looked upon favorably by outside accounting groups. You said an acronym, and I can't remember what it was. but
GFOA?
Thank you. Another acronym comes to mind, and that's GAN limit. And I don't know if we have any concerns like that when we're putting money away and spending interest and things like that, if they start to look a little closer when we have such a high reserve fund.
No, I mean, we have issues with the GAN limit, but I don't think it is exacerbated or increased or changed at all by setting money aside as additional reserves. So I mean, to the extent we have, you know, a $90 million budget and we say we want to put 10 million a year aside for a city hall, so we're only going to spend 80. I mean, maybe in that case, but that's not what we're suggesting. So, you know, we are close to the GAN limit. It's, you know, sort of an issue that newer cities face. And so it's something we're going to have to deal with every year, but following these policy recommendations won't impact that at all.
Thank you. Any other questions, comments? Are we on the right track, Council?
Well, just to be clear, in the Finance Committee meeting, I went along with suggesting that we do move that to 40% based on a few years ago and the recommendation. So I would give that direction also to staff.
All right, well, thank you very much. Let me just ask real fast, do some formalities. Madam Clerk, do we have any requests to speak? And did we receive any correspondence on our workshop?
No, we did not.
All right, thank you. With that, we will go ahead and adjourn our meeting. It is 5:18, and we'll see everybody at 6 o'clock. Thank you.